Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another Expert View. My name is Matt Birdwhistle from HSO. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Fhaheen Khan from Make UK. He's a senior economist with the Make UK, and he's here to talk to us about the very recent report published on March the 18th, reviewing the quarter one results for manufacturers. So, welcome, Fhaheen.
Thank you, Matt, and it's a pleasure to be back here again.
No, thank you so much. So I guess let's begin at the top. What are the highlights for this quarter?
Yeah, it's interesting, quite sobering results depending on what perspective you look at it. And we've seen a compared to the previous quarter. I mean, it's all relative, I guess, depending on how you look at it. Output and orders have been showing a market slowdown in activity. We already saw a strong signal of orders actually slowing down from the second half of last year. And so we weren't surprised by that. But unfortunately, output has moved in line with that direction and has also declined in production, which suggests that manufacturers are reducing their production levels for the things that they make in the UK because there isn't enough demand there to satisfy that growth. At the same time, we've seen prices have actually marginally increased in this quarter, which suggests that businesses may be battling costs rising again. And we've also seen margins actually fail to improve. So that is not the most fortunate news for the industry. However, there were some bright sides to the data. We've seen investment intentions rise. Manufacturers seem quite confident about continuing to invest in plant and machinery and human capital. And they seem this strong, robust demand to hire labor, which suggests that despite the bleak picture that the Q1 results present, manufacturers themselves don't necessarily feel that that's how things are going to be looking forward. And as a final point, our forecasts for the next 2 years are not great. They're quite anemic. We expect manufacturing output to grow slower than the wider economy, growing just barely up 0% this year, and about half as much growth as the UK GDP in 2025.
So I did notice as well in the report, Fhaheen, probably I guess slightly contradictory in the trends of declining output orders and output volumes and order volumes. But business confidence is actually picking up. What do you think is behind that?
Yeah, the story that we're starting to see, the picture that we're seeing in terms of confidence is actually quite an interesting one. I mean, if you just give me a moment, I'm going to very quickly just share my screen to present a slide. So what we're looking at here in this specific data is our metrics for measuring confidence. So confidence in manufacturers' own business and confidence in the wider economy. Anything above a 5 suggests that across the sample, the confidence is more positive than it is negative. And we're just looking at the last couple of quarters here towards the sort of right-hand side of the data. And historically, when things go down, let's say if there's a shock to the economy, if there's interest rates rising, or there's the Suez Canal or something like that, confidence tends to go down alongside output and orders, and that's usually quite what you expect to see. But what we've been seeing since maybe early 2023, confidence has been almost completely unshaken by the various different turbulence that manufacturers in the UK have faced. I mean, if there's rising costs, if there's inflation, if energy costs are increasing, if there's tensions or global conflicts impacting supply chains, manufacturers appear to be almost unfazed by every single situation that they're dealing with, which suggests maybe is a sign that we are witnessing or observing in terms of data. Using data, the increasing resilience in the industry. Perhaps that's not so surprising given that manufacturers over the last 5-6 years or so have been firefighting crisis after crisis, and that may have changed the way they're approaching risk management or crisis management within their own businesses, which have made them better able to protect themselves against uncertain events. But then, I don't know whether we think that's a good thing, whether it's a good thing that manufacturers have had to adapt in that way where uncertainty has become the new normal. I don't really have a comment on that. I mean, is it true that is that something that's unique to the UK or other manufacturers in other countries are having to change in this way. We don't necessarily know, but what we are seeing is that manufacturers have adapted quite a lot. In that time, they've been, in fact, forced into that adaptation, which has changed the way that they are approaching dealing with negative situations. It may also be the fact that manufacturers are historically all a very bunch of optimistic people, and actually it doesn't really matter what happens in the wider economy. They always tend to feel that what's happening in their own business is fine, and that they'll be fine in the next 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, I mean that certainly seems to have been the case if we look back to last year, where again they were very bullish in what was going to happen for this year, and it's quite not panned out. But optimism still seems to be there. I mean, do you think there's obviously inflation's dropped? That was a big thing last year, and obviously energy costs were very high as well. But the decrease in the inflation rate and obviously interest rates coming down as well. So monetary policy being eased by the Bank of England. What impact do you think that is having in terms of manufacturers' confidence?
Yeah, so interest rates, interestingly, the Bank of England's intentions we know are pretty clear. Their role is to control spiraling inflation, and it seems to be that, at least from the perspective of the official statistics, is that their efforts are actually taking effect, and we are seeing consumer inflation on the downward trend. The OBR predicts that we'll be back to around 2% inflation sometime in June this year. And producer inflation has also reached kind of a deflationary point of view. The problem with or the risks associated with rising interest rates is that you achieve this decline in lower inflation by restricting the economy, and by restricting activity, you hope to increase unemployment to some extent to reduce demand, and that itself is what will result in declining prices. Manufacturers are aware of how this mechanism works, and so they're partially part of that reason may be unsurprised by the decline in order books, because actually it was the Bank of England's intention to actively restrict the economy, and they're seeing the impacts of that. However, it isn't affecting, let's say, in investment intentions per se so much. Manufacturing is quite an old industry, and 5.25% interest rate as a base rate to them is not a high interest rate, because they've gone through the 70s and the 80s when interest rates were above 10 to 15% in some cases. Many of us may have gotten comfortable with seeing 1 or 2% interest rate because of what we have experienced from the financial crisis, but the long run average interest rate from the last 20 to 30, 40 years, actually, where we are today is still, it's not an unreasonable rate of interest, and most businesses don't see that as a restrictor to their own activities. So it's having an effect. I think people are behaving slightly differently than they were before, but manufacturers seem to be planning ahead anyway.
Okay, no, thank you. Um, uh, One of the other things that I've noticed as well, and this might be related, is there were quite some significant regional differences that last year weren't maybe quite as apparent. But I can see from the stats that the southeast is definitely really going in comparison to some other regions. But what's your take on those regional differences that we're seeing?
Yeah, there was quite a sharp difference in regions this quarter compared to what we saw across last year, where, as you say, the differences were quite tight. Um, the Southeast is an interesting case. It's partly down to the composition of the type of manufacturers that tend to live in that part of the UK. And actually, manufacturing is such a diverse industry that not every region is the same. We know the West Midlands, for example, is much more heavily dominated with the automotive manufacturing supply chain. Wales, for example, as a developed nation, is much more dominated by aerospace. And then we have the Northeast, which has quite a lot in chemicals and pharmaceuticals. And what's interesting about the Southeast, is that there's a huge dominance in two particular industries: food and drink, which tends to perform well when there's an economic decline, because people always need to buy food even if they are struggling. And secondly is the electronics subsector, which we will find quite surprising. But then I guess when you think about what's been happening to policy from a government perspective recently, so the Chancellor in November 2023 made full expense in capital allowances permanent, which meant that manufacturers were be able to invest in plant machinery and new technologies. and be able to claim back on the using capital allowances to claim back on corporation tax, which makes accessing new electronic goods much easier. But that would also result in a benefit to the electronic subsector, who are the producers of those technologies, often automation technologies and robotics and even plant machinery. And so we have seen an uptick in growth for those type of firms who tend to be the beneficiaries of policies like that, because it tends to be their products that see an increase in demand, as manufacturers who are digitalizing or investing in net zero will look to those companies to access those technologies. So, it's interesting, and it's ultimately a good story, but it also doesn't bode well for the leveling up debate, where you'll see those in areas of the UK that tend to be concentrated with those higher value firms continuously do better, and then those who may be neglected from the government's perspective um, continue to fall behind, and we do risk that getting worse going forward.
Yeah, so I guess that leads into the government's industrial strategy, if it ever sees the light of day. Hopefully, it does do. But obviously, the leveling up is going to be an important part of that. Um, a couple of final questions, I guess, from myself, but one that I wanted to touch upon, and we kind of talked a little bit about what the Bank of England are doing, and monetary policy and so on. But I guess the question is, the media has said we're in a technical recession, but from the reality of what manufacturers are dealing with, are we actually in a recession?
Mm. The When the ONS published and revised their figures for Q3 and Q4 of 2023, we were technically in a recession, because the UK GDP had declined by 0.1%, 0.3% in consecutive quarters, respectively. But historically speaking, it's probably one of, if we do even consider a recession, probably the weakest one we may have ever had in our economic history, or at least in memorable history. And many analysts and our own data suggest that, at least, yeah, we're already towards the end of Q1 now, and we need two quarters of growth to actually be officially out of a technical recession, to be in a technical boom, I suppose, if you want to call it. We are probably already out of it already, but that doesn't, I guess, hide the fact that manufacturing as an industry, even if it itself is out of recession and the UK economy is out of a recession, it is stagnating and following behind the average UK performance. So even if we are still growing, we're growing slower than the rest of the UK, and that itself is a problem, that the growth is quite anemic. So I would say we're not really in a recession anymore, but we're not really doing that much to grow either, and that itself is a problem, especially when you look at other countries, particularly the US, who are experiencing tremendous growth at the moment. That is outside of the average experience within UK and also other European nations.
Yeah, and I'm guessing. I mean, there are still some strong headwinds affecting manufacturers. I mean, obviously, with what's going on in the Red Sea at the moment, that's having impacts on the supply chain, and delivery times. It's very similar to the Suez Canal crisis a while back. What are the other headwinds that you were seeing that will affect manufacturers?
I think perhaps one of the biggest ones right now is the labor shortages. At the moment, there seems to be a strong demand for workers, even now, even as order books decline. And manufacturers are just not getting the people that they need to grow. So even if those, particularly SMEs who have ambitions to become large businesses, um, despite having those ambitions, they're not able to see, like, that the growth is unachievable without the people that they need to be there. Of course, the government has announced various measures, such as investments for apprenticeships, and these might somewhat alleviate the challenges along the way. But we are many years away from actually seeing those young people who are going to be going into training, to actually leaving education to actually enter the workforce. There isn't really a solution to skills at the moment, and whilst you can look abroad for people, there's, of course, at the moment not a very strong desire from government to access labor from overseas, even though manufacturer historically has accessed labor from overseas. Supply chain disruption does remain an issue. The Red Sea tensions have increased lead times on average for about 2 to 3 weeks for most businesses, but they have found that to be quite manageable, and partly because they have dealt with the situation, as you already mentioned, in that part of the world before, and so there's a little bit more crisis management built in to those businesses. There are other potential risk factors. I think most people will be aware that there was an earthquake in Japan, for example, not too long ago, and that actually led to the shutdown of several semiconductor plants in Japan. And whilst Japan is a small supplier of semiconductors, they're not as big as South Korea or Taiwan. They do contribute to that supply chain. And at the moment, those factories are shut down because the areas that people used to live in to go to work in those factories have all been moved out for health and safety reasons. And so there's no news on whether or not those factories are going to be reopened again. And I think we are yet to see the impact of that unfold within the supply chain, because what's happened, at least until now, is that most manufacturers have built in huge stock levels of things that they might be worried about because they have learned from past experience that actually it's better to be safe than sorry. And so they have huge stock levels of inputs and components that they might need to use. Because of those stock levels, they're able to not think about what's happening in the rest of the world so much, because a problem today is not really going to affect your business today, but it might affect you 6 to 9 months from now, and that's the problem that's difficult to manage.
Indeed. Well, I think, yes, what you've just outlined certainly sets out the challenges for 2024 and into 25. So never easy in the world of manufacturing. But Fhaheen, it's been great to have you share your insights with us today. Very much appreciated. And once again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.